So today we're jumping into a story that asks a pretty wild question. Can true happiness actually be decoded from the logo on a cigarette pack? Let's unpack this idea of living A+ life in a minus world.
So the whole idea really kicks off with this, well, kind of bizarre question. How on earth can a simple cigarette pack hold the key to a happier life? It sounds a little crazy, I know, but believe it or not, that is exactly where our story begins.
Okay, so let's set the scene. The author of this column, who's a missionary, is out on a merchant ship surrounded by Chinese sailors. Now, his whole goal is to connect with these guys, but he's hitting a major wall. And that wall is a massive language barrier. The first mate knows just a handful of English words, so any attempt at a real conversation just completely falls flat. So you've got the author just sipping his coffee, wondering how in the world he can possibly break through this silence. And then something completely random happens. Seriously, the sailor finishes his cigarette and he tosses the empty pack over towards a trash can, but he misses. It kind of bounces and lands right on the author's lap. And this one tiny chance event, it ends up changing everything. So he picks up the pack and takes a look at the brand name. He sees two identical Chinese characters side by side, Xi. And right below it, in English, it says double happy. Now he knows the character Xi means joy or happiness, so Xi literally means double joy. And right then and there, an idea starts to click into place. He realizes, okay, this is his opening. He decides to use the pack to finally start a real conversation. So he points to the brand name and asks the sailor, does smoting this, does it really make you double happy? Well, the sailor doesn't even need words to answer that. He just clutches his chest and lets out this series of really deep, painful coughs. I mean, it's immediately obvious that these so-called double happy cigarettes are a source of suffering for him, not joy. And that opens the door for the author to share a totally different idea of what happiness could be.
And this is where the author's insight gets really interesting. He asks the sailor to look closer at the characters for double happy. He basically suggests that there's a kind of code hidden inside the very strokes of the word. He tells him to look for plus signs, or what's called shipchaga in Korean, which actually means cross.
So he poses the question to the sailor, how many plus signs, or, crosses, can you actually find inside this word? And according to the author's really unique way of seeing it, if you look at the two double happy characters together, you can find a total of 6. And right here, this is the absolute crucial point for the author. He argues that these aren't just accidental shapes or lines. No, to him, they are symbols of the cross. He uses this incredible visual connection to explain his belief that true double happiness isn't found in a cigarette, but can be found through Jesus. So completely bypassing that language barrier, the author uses little diagrams and some writing to share this whole perspective. And what the source material tells us is that the sailor was so moved by this unique interpretation found on his own cigarette pack that he embraced the idea. And in doing so, he found a totally new kind of joy, what the author calls a plus life. But the column doesn't stop with that sailor on the ship. The author argues that this modern day's transformation he just witnessed, well, it echoes one of the most powerful stories of transformation ever told. So, to really understand what he means by a plus life, we need to shift gears and look at the story of Lazarus. Okay, so here's the quick timeline of what happens. Lazarus, who's a good friend of Jesus, gets sick and he dies. But here's the thing. Jesus doesn't show up right away. He actually arrives 4 days after the burial, when all hope is completely gone. And it's at this moment that he makes this staggering declaration to Lazarus' grieving sister Martha. And this moment right here, it just captures the core tension perfectly. You see, Martha is expressing the conventional belief of the time. She says, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day, someday far off in the future. But Jesus responds with something so radical and so immediate. He doesn't say he will cause the resurrection. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Right here, right now, in the present tense. And then, standing right there in front of the tomb, he speaks a simple but incredibly powerful command into the silence. As you see it written here in Korean, he says, Lazarus, come out. And what happens next is just impossible. Lazarus, who had been dead and buried for 4 days, walks out of his own tomb. He's still tangled up in his burial wrappings. It is a complete and total reversal of his fate. Okay, so how does this ancient miracle connect all the way back to that sailor and his cigarette pack? Well, the author uses this very story to define what he calls the double plus life.
So the connection the author makes here is a really powerful one. The idea is that just as Jesus completely rewrote Lazarus' story from tragedy to triumph, he can transform any life. The town's song of sorrow literally becomes a song of victory. And in the author's view, Lazarus himself becomes the ultimate example of what it truly means to be double happy.
So let's break it down. What does this double happy life really mean according to the column? Well, for starters, it's a joy that doesn't depend on your environment or what you own. It's a life of what's called learned contentment. You can see the Korean term there, jajok. It's all about finding a double plus life even when you're in a minus world. And from the author's perspective, the key that unlocks all of this is Jesus.
And so this entire journey, based on a single column, takes us from a discarded cigarette pack on a ship all the way to an empty tomb in Bethany, all to explore one central idea. And in the end, it leaves us with a really big question to think about. Where does lasting happiness truly come from? Is it something we find out there in the world, or is it something that transforms our world from within?